37-hour journey to Sydney began a BART train to the airport, just as most of my adventures seemed to do. The fog was beginning to burn off as we made our way south down the peninsula, and was almost completely gone by the time we reached SFO. Seeing the planes at the international terminal as you pull into the airport station always inspires the feeling of excitement at the idea of seeing new places and experiencing things I'd never before imagined. We arrived early enough to beat the large crowds checking in, but we still ended up waiting in line as Singapore Airlines were training new staff at the counters. We made our way through security in under 5 minutes and sat at our gate watching the ground crew prep our plane as we made last-minute phone calls canceling various services we wouldn't need anymore. Boarding was quick and we settled in our seats for the 11.5-hour flight to Seoul, South Korea. We taxied down to runway 28 left and were greeted to the side of the Lufthansa A380 arriving on the parallel. As we climbed out, you could see the fog hugging the Pacific coastline, and for a brief second we got a glimpse of the Farallon Islands through the breaks in the clouds. The flight was completely full, but the 777's spacious interior made it feel more comfortable than most 747 flights I'd been on in the past. I spent most of the flight listening to my iPod, keeping track of our progress on the moving map display and watching other passengers' movies, albeit without sound. Rebecca was hoping to see Alaska and the Aleutian Islands for the first time, but unfortunately the weather did not cooperate. We were very excited when we realized our route would take us right over central Japan, and the cloud cover cleared just enough to be greeted to a majestic view of Mount Fuji as the sun started to set. We had hoped to catch a glimpse of the South Korean coastline as well, but the light ran out and all we saw were the lights on the ports and docks. We'd been under the impression that we wouldn't have to deboard in Seoul, and that we could just sleep in our seats while people got on and off the plane. But we were informed just before landing that we'd all have to get off along with our carry-ons and hang out in the terminal for an hour while they cleaned the plane. The terminal was clean and new, the water fountains were triggered by motion sensors, and there was even a little kiosk where tourists could get their picture taken wearing traditional Korean garments. After an hour of experiencing South Korea, we reboarded our plane, sat back in our same seats, and continued on with our journey to Singapore. The flight to Singapore was uneventful, and we arrived at Changi Airport just after 1 a.m. local time, and got a brief feel of the Southeast Asian warmth and humidity as we stepped onto the jetway. The terminal was dead and empty at this time of the night, and having barely slept more than an hour in the last day, I laid down on the first bench I saw. I put on some Mozart on my headphones, and using my shoes as a pillow, I tried to get some sleep. We had just over 6 hours in Singapore, and I tried to make the most of the opportunity to lay horizontal. I ended up sleeping for almost 3 hours, and right after waking up, I came across this sleeping area full of cots for transit passengers to get some rest. Just after 7 a.m. we boarded our A330 to Sydney. The flight was only about a third full, and Rebecca and I took full advantage of this by spreading out and each grabbing a whole row of seats to ourselves. The sun was just coming up as we taxied out to the runway. 6 years ago I was here in Singapore and spent a whole day walking the perimeter of the airport. As we taxied out, I got to see a lot of the same drainage ditches and fences I had to jump across to complete my expedition all those years ago. The takeoff from Singapore was smooth despite an impressive array of large cumulus clouds scattered throughout the area. As we turned south, we got a glimpse of the large number of tankers and cargo ships that Singapore is famous for. About an hour into the flight, we flew directly over the city of Jakarta, Indonesia. Jakarta had never been that high on my list of cities I'd wish to visit, so after this I figured that was close enough to cross it off. We entered Australia just a few miles northeast of Port Hedland, Western Australia, a small town of about 15,000 people. This would be the last sign of civilization for the next 4 hours as we crossed the barren and desolate interior of Australia. I mostly passed the time reading the obituaries in the Singaporean newspapers they gave us for free as we boarded the flight. I watched old Woody Allen movies that I'd seen countless times before. After a while, I had to fight the urge to talk to the flight attendants in my Woody Allen voice and saying things like, "I can't have any more coffee because my analyst says it makes me too neurotic." For a while, the atmospheric conditions allowed us to view our engines creating contrails right outside our windows. I doubted there was anyone on the ground to see them trail across the sky. About a half hour outside of Sydney, we started to see signs of people and towns as we crossed into New South Wales, including the densely forested Blue Mountains. We approached Sydney from the south and got a great view of the city of Wollongong, where Rebecca and I would be attending a wedding just a few days later. We turned left over Cronulla and lined up for approach to runway 34 left, passing over the iconic refineries on Botany Bay. Hey, you could probably see our house if we were on the other side of the plane. It's a shame. It had been 37 hours since we first left home in San Francisco. We flew to a city so far away that you couldn't fly to it nonstop, just to get to a city that you could easily fly to nonstop. I couldn't tell you what time it was or even what day it was when we arrived, but the journey was complete and we were back in Rebecca's hometown of Sydney, Australia.